The smell of burnt rubber and fresh asphalt hit me before I even saw what they had done. My private driveway had vanished beneath a brand-new road, built by the HOA without my permission. Standing beside the construction crew was the HOA president, calmly telling me that my land was now community property. I had paid for every inch of that property, yet somehow, I was the one being treated like a trespasser. What she didn't know was that this fight was far from over. What would you do if someone paved over your property overnight? Tell me where you're watching from. So, how did my peaceful new home turn into a full-blown property war? It all began months earlier, when I thought I had finally found the perfect place to live. 3 months before the road appeared, I was standing in my empty garage holding a set of house keys that finally felt like mine. My name is Garrett Rockwell, and after 30 years in commercial construction, I had sold my company, left the noise of Dallas behind, and bought 3 acres of Texas Hill Country where my wife Elena and I could finally slow down. The property was simple but special. A quiet house, a long gravel driveway, and one important detail written into the deed: the access road belonged to me. I had paid extra for that privacy, and I protected it like any other investment. Every Saturday morning, I walked that road with a coffee in my hand, checking the fence posts, the gravel surface, and the survey markers placed exactly where the property line ran. I knew every turn, every patch of grass, every crack in the old stones. It was not just a driveway. It was the boundary between my life and everyone else's expectations. For the first year, everything worked. Then I met Vivian Ashworth. She was the president of Willowbrook Commons HOA, and she had a reputation for turning small neighborhood issues into official battles. But when she first approached me, she was not angry. She was polite, almost too polite. She arrived one afternoon wearing a perfect smile and carrying a folder against her chest. "Garrett, we are planning some improvements near the entrance," she said. "Nothing major, just making the neighborhood more welcoming." I looked at the plan she handed me and noticed a yellow line drawn across my access road. "That is my property," I told her. She glanced down, then back at me. "There seems to be some confusion about that." I asked her to send any documents proving otherwise. She nodded, thanked me, and left. I thought that was the end of it. Looking back, that was my first mistake. I assumed paperwork mattered more than confidence. I assumed someone would not risk crossing a legal boundary just because they wanted something. A week later, I received an email from the HOA announcing a community entrance improvement project. My road was listed as part of the plan. I immediately pulled out my deed, reviewed the recorded documents, and contacted the county records office. Everything confirmed what I already knew. The road was mine. But then another document appeared, one I had never seen before, and it carried a claim that made me realize Vivian was not asking for permission. She believed she already had the right to take control. The document Vivian sent was not a deed, not a survey, and not a legal transfer. It was something much more dangerous. A signed HOA resolution claiming my private road had become a shared community asset through what they called historical access use. I read that sentence 3 times because I could not believe what I was seeing. A neighborhood vote did not erase a property record. A board meeting did not rewrite a deed. But Vivian was acting like confidence was the same thing as authority. I called the county clerk's office the next morning and requested every recorded document connected to my property. The answer came back faster than I expected. There was no transfer, no easement, no agreement, nothing that gave Willowbrook Commons control over my road. I thought that meant I had the upper hand. I was wrong. 2 days later, construction crews arrived. The sound of heavy equipment rolling across gravel woke me before sunrise. Through my kitchen window, I watched trucks turning toward my driveway with orange cones stacked in the beds. I walked outside and stopped the project manager before his crew could unload. "You know this is private property, right?" I asked. He looked uncomfortable and pulled out a folder. "I'm just following the approved plans." The HOA provided all the paperwork. That sentence bothered me. Not because he sounded confident, but because he sounded like he truly believed he was protected. I asked to see what they had. The paperwork contained the same HOA resolution, along with a letter from a local attorney stating that the community had reasonable grounds to improve the access route. Reasonable grounds. That was the phrase they were hiding behind. They did not have ownership. They did not have permission. They had an argument. And arguments can become expensive when someone has enough money to keep them alive. I called an attorney who specialized in property disputes. After reviewing everything, he gave me advice I did not want to hear. Garrett, you can fight this, but understand something. The longer construction continues, the harder it becomes to undo the damage. That was the first moment I realized this was not just about a road. It was about creating a situation where I would be forced to negotiate after the fact. Vivian was not trying to prove she owned my property. She was trying to make everyone act like she did. Then came the meeting notice. The HOA scheduled an emergency community meeting and listed my road project as a completed neighborhood improvement. Elena sat beside me at the kitchen table reading the notice while the ceiling fan clicked above us. "They are not asking anymore," she said quietly. She was right. But when I arrived at that meeting and saw the map displayed behind Vivian's presentation, I noticed something that changed everything. My road was not the only part of my property they had marked as community land. The map behind Vivian was not just showing my driveway. It showed the entire western edge of my property highlighted in bright yellow, including a section of land behind my house where my workshop sat. I felt the room get quieter as I looked closer. The Homeowners Association was not simply trying to improve an access road. They were presenting a plan that treated my private land like an extension of their neighborhood. Vivian stood at the front of the room, clicking through slides with the calm confidence of someone who believed the decision had already been made. "This project benefits everyone," she said. "It creates better access and increases property values." A few residents nodded. They saw fresh pavement and a nicer entrance. They did not see the boundary lines underneath it. I raised my hand and asked one question. "Can you show everyone where the recorded easement is?" The room went silent. Vivian paused for just a second, then smiled. "Garrett, we have already reviewed those concerns." That answer bothered me more than if she had argued. She was not denying the question. She was avoiding it. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me quietly. Some apologized. Others admitted they had never seen the full map before. One older homeowner named Frank pulled me aside near the parking lot and lowered his voice. "You should look into how this project was approved." Something about it moved very quickly. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with every document spread out in front of me. The smell of cold coffee filled the room as I compared the original property records with the new construction plans. Then I noticed something I had missed before. The project description listed my road as a future community access corridor dated 6 months earlier. 6 months earlier, before Vivian ever spoke to me. Someone had already decided what my property would become before I was even informed. The next morning, I contacted the engineering company listed on the construction documents. I expected resistance. Instead, I got hesitation. The project engineer admitted that the plans came from the Homeowners Association with supporting paperwork they assumed had been verified. Then he said something that made me stop writing. There was one document attached that seemed unusual. He told me it was an old agreement supposedly signed by the previous owner of my property, an agreement allowing future neighborhood expansion. I knew my old neighbor, George Blackwood, had owned the land before me. I also knew he was careful with every contract he signed. But if that document was real, it could change everything. I requested a copy immediately. When the email arrived, I opened the attachment and saw George's name at the bottom of the page. For a moment, I thought I had lost. Then I noticed the date on the document, and something about it made no sense at all. The date on the agreement was 6 years before George Blackwood ever purchased the property. I stared at the screen, feeling the confusion build. George could not have signed a document connected to land he did not own. Someone had used his name before he even had a legal connection to the property. For the first time, I stopped thinking about the road and started thinking about the people behind it. This was not a misunderstanding. Someone had built an entire plan around a document that should never have existed. I called George's daughter, Sarah, because she handled some of her father's old records before I bought the land. I expected uncertainty. Instead, there was a long silence. Then she said, "Garrett, my father had a problem with those people years ago." That was the first piece of history nobody had mentioned. Sarah explained that George once discussed selling a small portion of land near the entrance, but he rejected the offer because he wanted to keep the access road private. He was not a man who liked shortcuts. He measured everything twice and signed nothing without understanding every word. I asked if she had ever seen the agreement they were using. She said no, but she remembered something else. Before George passed away, He kept a locked file cabinet in his workshop with documents he considered important. I drove there that afternoon and looked through the old papers Sarah had preserved. The workshop smelled like dust, cedar, and old motor oil. His tools were still arranged exactly where he left them. Inside that cabinet, I found property maps, tax records, and handwritten notes. But the original agreement was missing. In its place was a note from George written on the back of an old receipt. It said only one sentence: "Never let them turn a promise into ownership." I felt the weight of those words because they changed the entire situation. George knew someone might try this. The problem was proving what happened. Meanwhile, Vivian was moving faster. The HOA sent another notice stating that construction would continue and that any delays caused by property disputes could result in additional costs being assigned to affected parties. They were creating financial pressure. If I challenged them and lost, I could be buried under expenses. If I waited, they would keep building until removing the project became even harder. My attorney gave me a difficult choice. We could immediately file for emergency court protection, but it would require time, money, and evidence strong enough to convince a judge. Or we could investigate further and risk the project moving forward. That night, I stood at the edge of my driveway watching construction lights glow in the distance. The road I had protected was becoming something I never agreed to. Then my phone rang. It was the county records office. The clerk said they found another filing connected to my property, and it was something nobody had mentioned before. The county records clerk finally opened the mystery file, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had something solid. Inside was a recorded maintenance agreement from 20 years earlier, but it was not what Vivian claimed. The document showed that the previous owner had allowed temporary access for utility work, not permanent community use. My attorney reviewed it and immediately saw the difference. This was the evidence we needed. Within days, we filed our response and requested a hearing to stop the project. For the first time, Vivian looked less certain. At the next meeting, she arrived without her usual presentation slides. She listened quietly as my attorney explained the timeline and pointed out the false interpretation of the old agreement. Several neighbors who had stayed silent began asking questions. The room that once felt controlled by the HOA suddenly felt different. Then came the moment I thought would end everything. The county issued a temporary order preventing the HOA from expanding construction onto the disputed sections of my property until the matter was reviewed. I walked back to my truck that evening with the same gravel beneath my boots, but it felt different. I thought I had finally forced them to stop. Elena hugged me when I got home, and for the first time in weeks, we talked about normal things again. We talked about repairing the fence, restoring the driveway, and putting the stress behind us. But the next morning, my attorney called before sunrise. His voice was different. The order helped us, but it had revealed something we had not seen before. The HOA was not only relying on the old agreement. They had already made financial commitments based on the project. Contracts had been signed. Money had changed hands. And now, people outside the neighborhood had an interest in keeping the project alive. I drove to the construction site and saw something that made my stomach drop. The workers were not expanding the road anymore. They were installing permanent drainage structures along the edge of my property. When I asked the supervisor why they were continuing work after the order, he showed me another document. It was a permit approved by the county months earlier. The permit did not list my road as HOA property. It listed the project under a different name entirely. That was the moment I realized Vivian had planned for a challenge. She had created layers of paperwork, contractors, and approvals so that even if one piece failed, the rest of the machine kept moving. I went back through every document we had collected, looking for the connection we missed. Then I found it. The company listed on the permit was not owned by the HOA, but its registered address led to a place I recognized immediately. The registered address was not a construction company office. It was a small suite inside a commercial building I had driven past dozens of times. But the name on the mailbox stopped me cold. It belonged to Thornwell Property Group, a company connected to Vivian's husband, Rick. Suddenly, all those pieces that never quite fit started forming a picture. The HOA was not simply trying to improve a road. They were working with a private development company that stood to benefit from changing the way my land was used. I brought the information to my attorney, expecting excitement. Instead, he became quiet. "Garrett, this changes the case, but it also raises the stakes. He explained that proving a conflict of interest was different from proving illegal action. We needed a clear connection between the approvals, the contracts, and the decisions made by people who had authority. The next step was not another argument. It was building a timeline that showed who knew what and when they knew it. For the first time, I stopped reacting to Vivian's moves and started thinking like the person who had been planning this from the beginning. I reviewed every meeting notice, every email, and every public record with a different question. Not what did they do, but what were they preparing to do? That change mattered. Buried inside a series of planning documents, I found a reference to a future expansion project called Willowbrook Commons Phase 2. My property was listed as a connection point for that expansion. Not a possibility, not a suggestion, a plan component. The road was only the first step. They needed access through my land to make the larger project work. I finally understood why Vivian had been so determined. She was not fighting for a nicer entrance. She was protecting a business plan. But the discovery created a new problem. The more I learned, the more complicated the situation became. Rick Thornwell was not just Vivian's husband. He was involved in local development approvals, which meant every conversation needed to be handled carefully. One wrong accusation could make me look like a frustrated property owner attacking a public official. My attorney warned me not to confront them publicly yet. Let them believe they are ahead, he said. People reveal more when they think they have already won. That was difficult for me. I wanted to walk into that HOA office and put every document on Vivian's desk, but I knew anger would help her more than it helped me. So I waited. And while I waited, Vivian made her next move. A certified letter arrived at my house with a notice that changed everything. The HOA was no longer claiming my road was community property. They were claiming I had violated an agreement I never signed. The certified letter felt heavier than it should have when I opened it at my kitchen table. Inside was a claim from Willowbrook Commons stating that I had violated a private access agreement connected to my own property. It was the kind of document designed to make a normal homeowner panic. But after everything I had uncovered, I noticed the pattern immediately. They were changing the argument because the old one was failing. They could no longer pretend they owned my road. So now they were pretending I had broken a promise. I brought the letter to my attorney, and this time I did not ask what we could do. I asked what they were afraid we would find. That question changed the entire strategy. We organized every piece of information we had collected. The false agreement using George Blackwood's name. The timeline showing the expansion plans existed before the HOA contacted me. The construction documents connecting the project to Thornwell Property Group. The county records showing the difference between temporary access and permanent control. Every detail that once felt disconnected now created a clear picture. But Vivian was not waiting quietly. She scheduled another HOA meeting and invited residents to discuss what she called protecting the community from unnecessary conflict. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to control the story before the facts reached everyone else. When I arrived, I saw something different from the first meeting. People were not looking at me like I was the problem. They were looking at the documents in their hands. Several neighbors had started asking questions. The pressure was moving, but Vivian still had one advantage. She understood something I had underestimated. Most people do not follow property disputes closely. They follow confidence. And Vivian had spent years building trust inside that neighborhood. She spoke calmly, avoided accusations, and presented herself as someone trying to protect homeowners from a difficult situation. For a moment, I understood why some people believed her. She was not reckless. She was careful. She knew exactly how much information to reveal and exactly how much to hide. That made her more dangerous. Before the meeting ended, Vivian made one final announcement. She said the HOA had scheduled a formal review of the property records and would present evidence showing that my concerns were based on a misunderstanding of the original ownership documents. My attorney leaned toward me and whispered that this was the moment we had been waiting for. If they had real evidence, they would finally have to show it. If they did not, their entire position could collapse. But when Vivian walked out of the meeting, she left behind one document on the table. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was a copy of an old survey map. And written in the corner was a handwritten note that made me realize the final battle was not going to happen over the road. It was going to happen over who had been controlling the property records for years. Edit. The handwritten note on the survey map was the first thing that made Vivian stop smiling. It was not a legal argument. It was not a demand. It was a warning from years ago, written by George Blackwood himself. The note referenced a boundary review that happened before Willowbrook Commons existed, before the HOA had any authority, before anyone imagined turning that quiet stretch of land into a neighborhood expansion. My attorney studied the map carefully and compared it with every document we had collected. The conclusion was simple. The survey used by the HOA had ignored the original property markers and relied on a later interpretation that was never approved by the owner. The next meeting was no longer a neighborhood discussion. It was a showdown. Vivian arrived with the same calm expression she always wore, but I noticed small changes. She kept checking the documents in front of her. She asked her attorney more questions than usual. She knew the room had shifted. When she spoke, she did not attack me. Instead, she tried a different approach. She told everyone that mistakes happen, that the project was meant to help the community, and that nobody intended to harm a property owner. It was a careful response, almost reasonable, and that was exactly why it worked on some people. She was not defending the road anymore. She was defending her image. I watched her present the situation as a complicated misunderstanding between neighbors. But then my attorney placed the timeline on the table. Not with anger, not with accusations, just dates. The expansion plans created before my permission was requested. The documents prepared before the dispute became public. The company connection that showed the project had interests beyond simple neighborhood improvement. The room became quiet. Vivian looked at the papers, then looked at the residents. For the first time, she had no immediate answer. But she was not finished. She pointed to the old access agreement and argued that even if some details were unclear, the community had relied on that access for years. She claimed stopping the project would hurt innocent homeowners who had nothing to do with the dispute. It was the strongest argument she had made, and I understood why. She had moved the fight away from ownership and toward consequences. She wanted everyone to fear what would happen if she lost. That was when I realized the final step could not just be proving she was wrong. I had to prove why the truth mattered more than the project she built around it. My attorney opened the final folder we had prepared. Inside was the one document we had been waiting to present. A document that connected the missing piece between the false agreement, the expansion plans, and the decisions made behind closed doors. When it reached the table, Vivian read the first page, and the color left her face. The document Vivian was holding was the missing connection we had been searching for. It was a development planning agreement between Thornwell Property Group and the HOA that referenced my land as a future access point before the HOA ever contacted me. It showed the road project was never just a neighborhood improvement. It was part of a larger plan built around property they did not own. Vivian read the pages slowly, and for the first time, she looked less like someone defending a decision and more like someone realizing the foundation underneath it was disappearing. The hearing that followed focused on the records, not emotions. The original deed, George Blackwood's. Property notes, the temporary access agreement, the project timeline, and the connection between the HOA plans and the private development documents all told the same story. The HOA had acted beyond its authority. The temporary access arrangement was not ownership. A community vote was not a transfer of property rights. The county review confirmed that the construction affecting my land had to stop, and the HOA was required to remove the unauthorized improvements and restore the affected areas. The financial consequences followed through the HOA process. The costs tied to the improper project could not simply be passed on to homeowners as a community expense. Vivian's leadership was challenged by residents who had trusted her decisions, and the board began reviewing how the project had been approved and presented. Rick's involvement also became part of the public record, creating questions about whether personal interests had influenced decisions connected to the expansion plans. For me, the victory was not watching someone lose power. It was standing at the end of my driveway and seeing the boundary markers exactly where they belonged. The same gravel road that had been covered with fresh asphalt and community signs was mine again. Months earlier, I had stood there while people told me I was confused about my own property. Now the documents they ignored were the same documents that protected me. Elena and I rebuilt the fence, repaired the damaged sections of the land, and returned the property to the quiet place we originally bought. I kept George's handwritten note in my office, not because I needed a reminder of the fight, but because it represented the lesson that saved my property. Details matter, records matter, and patience matters. Vivian believed control came from being the loudest person in the room. I learned that real ownership comes from being prepared when the truth finally gets its chance to speak. The road was never theirs to take, and the deed was always waiting to prove it.